Mr. Angus. We weren't having translation, so please begin again, and I'll see if it's corrected.
Is it working? C'est correct maintenant?
Is it working?
Yeah, please proceed.
Okay. We are now at about the 40-hour mark of the Liberal obstruction of the Ethics Committee. 40 hours of obstruction represents an unprecedented interference and democratic accountability. 40 hours translated would have been 20 meetings. 20 meetings to gather witness testimony, to prepare reports, to move on to other issues. And yet the Liberals have decided to shut down the work of this committee. Now, some people might not think the Ethics Committee is a committee that people pay much attention to. And certainly we've had Liberals come in and say, nobody cares what happens here. But one of the fundamental features of the Ethics Committee, it's one of the checks and balance committees. It is why it has always had an opposition chair. So contrary to the misinformation by Liberals that this committee exists to help the ethics commissioner, that this committee is there to somehow, review just to review laws and make sure everything's good and easy, straightforward for the government. This is actually a check and balance committee, which is why oppositions always chair it. So the decision by the Prime Minister's office to shut down this committee is telling. I say this because the stories for why the Liberals are obstructing our committee continually changes. But last week it became crystal clear. Once we got past their arguments about boxer shorts and underwear and PPE and gloves and everything else, they were very clear. They said an investigation into the conflict of interest dealings on this pandemic was a direct attack on great Canadians, great Canadian charities, and great businesses. So this morning, I'm going to look into one of those great businesses that they're protecting, Palantir. Palantir Canada's mission statement: we're bringing cutting-edge Silicon Valley technology to the most important government institutions in Canada. So how did they set out to make those connections with government? Well, they hired one of the top Liberal insiders as their president, Mr. David McNaughton, who's as close to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as you can get, much closer than the Kielburger brothers. He co-chaired Justin Trudeau's election campaign. And as Liberals always do, they give great benefits to their buddies. So Mr. McNaughton was given pretty much an unprecedented gift in making him ambassador to the United States, which I think we'd agree is our most important trading partner. Mr. McNaughton came back from his work representing us and began to open doors into the inner workings of the Liberal government for the company Palantir. Meetings with Krista Friedland, meetings with Navdeep Bains, meetings right into the Prime Minister's office with the Prime Minister's close confidant Rick Tice. So what is Palantir? I think this is something that Canadians really need to know, because they need to know who it is that the Liberals are allowing in the back door. So now Peter Thiel founded this company, and he is a very, I think, disturbing public figure. In 2009, April 13th, 2009, he wrote a statement, and he says, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." Peter Thiel is an extreme libertarian billionaire who has made it clear that he does not believe in democracy. This is one of the great companies that the Liberals want to protect. Now, BBC has described Palantir as the, quote, scariest of America's tech giants. And why is that? Well, we'll get into that. But I'd like to talk also about Mr. Thiel and his connections to the extreme and the extremist right in the United States. I refer you to the article in The Public in June 2018, where it says Peter Thiel, a Stanford grad and Silicon Valley billionaire, is notable for his far right-wing libertarian views. Thiel first came to national attention when he gave a primetime speech at the 2016 Republican convention supporting Donald Trump, virtually the only Silicon Valley entrepreneur to back Trump. Now, PayPal made Thiel a multimillionaire, and his early investments in Facebook in 2004 made him a billionaire. He's invested in companies like LinkedIn, Lyft, Spotify, Reddit, Airbnb, and SpaceX. But it's his work in establishing Palantir with the CIA in targeting insurgents in Iraq. They created this technology that is now being used in the United States on its own citizens. So one of Palantir's co-founders is John Lonsdale, and I think my colleagues in the Liberals will be interested in him too, because this is another one of the great people that they feel that I am somehow attacking by asking for an investigation into how this company managed to get right into the Deputy Prime Minister's office. So Lonsdale was a protege of Thiel, and he was banned from campus at Stanford in 2014. This is according to the public, June 2018, that he was banned from campus in 2014 after he was accused of rape. And Stanford concluded he'd engaged in sexual misconduct and harassment. I'm giving that a direct quote because I don't know the facts of the case myself. In October 2016, a week after Trump's famous Hollywood Access tape was released, in which he bragged about grabbing women's private parts, Thiel contributed $1.25 million to the campaign of Trump. And at the same time, Thiel, and this is again from the public, June 2018, apologized for saying things in his book, The Diversity of Myths, such as that alleged date rapes were, quote, seductions that are later regretted. I think for a government that ties himself on being the feminist prime minister and the feminist government, such a comment, I think, is really, really concerning. Now, what's interesting is that Mr. Thiel made a public statement that he apologized for making these comments about date rape. He said, more than 2 decades ago, I co-wrote a book with several insensitive, crudely argued statements. And as I've said before, I wish I'd never written those things. I'm sorry for it. Rape in all forms is a crime. I regret writing passages that have been taken to suggest otherwise. And I'm very pleased that Mr. Thiel said it. People do grow up and change their views. But according to the article in the public, 3 months later, at a 30-year-old anniversary for the Stanford Review, Thiel said, told one former editor his, quote, apology was just for the media, that sometimes you have to tell them what they hear. So Donald Trump gets elected, and Peter Thiel and his so-called buddy network are huge in the transition. It was said that he was deeply involved in all the transition's internal workings, and that his fingerprints are all over the administration. And many of the San Francisco employees started calling him the shadow president. So this is the company that the Liberals have blocked our work from shining any light into. I'll refer you to September 11th, 2020 BuzzFeed article. Peter Thiel met with the racist fringe as he went in all out for Trump. And that article talks about how he held a dinner for influential, vocal white nationalists, extremist white nationalists in the United States. I find that very concerning. So what does this have to do with Canada? Well, Palantir's specialty is the data mining that they established working for the CIA. In fact, the CIA was one of their first investors through its venture capital arm in QTEL. Yes, the CIA has a venture capital arm. And it was Palantir's only customer for years as the company refined and improved its technology. By 2010, Palantir's customers were mostly government agencies, though there were some private companies in the mix. By 2015, Palantir was valued at $20 billion. Now, The Intercept Sam Biddle, who's covered Palantir for years, says, I think it's worth keeping in mind that Palantir sees itself not alongside Uber, Twitter, and Netflix, but alongside Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Booz Allen. Palantir wants to be a defense contractor. Now, what we've been told in the accusations against Palantir's specialty is that they are, quote, a monstrous government snoop. Palantir's work, the government agencies that contracted, and the relative lack of details about the company's inner workings. This is from a Voxcom article. I mean, it's often seen as a secretive, all-knowing, and even malevolent organization. Bloomberg ran a really interesting article on them called Palantir Knows Everything About You. And in a book with the phrase destroying democracy in the title, Robert Scheer called Palantir a monstrous government snoop, mining our most intimate data. The company's software has been criticized for its dragnet ways, pulling in records of millions of innocent people so it can catch a few possible criminals. Palantir's data mining software is used to analyze vast amounts of personal data held by the federal government to make determinations that affect people's lives with little or no oversight, says Jeremy D. Scott, Senior Counsel for the Electronic Privacy Information Center, which successfully sued Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, to get records on its work with Palantir. So I would think that Deputy Minister Friedland, given her intense knowledge of the international market, would know exactly who she was dealing with when she invited Palantir into her office. She would know that there were major human rights violations that had been levied against Palantir. And yet the Liberals on this committee do not want us to make those connections to Deputy Minister Friedland and this company Palantir. But I would ask them, I would beg them to stop talking about underwear at our committee and actually maybe read the 2020 Amnesty International report on Palantir. The Amnesty wrote a damning article about how Palantir's technology that was created during the War of Terror, that was created in Iraq and in the battlefields of Afghanistan to target citizens and people in the United States. And who did they target? Well, through the police, they target racialized communities, and they targeted immigrant families. And this is what Michael Kleinman, the director of Amnesty International Silicon Valley Initiative, says. Palantir touts its ethical commitments, saying it will never work with regimes that abuse human rights abroad. This is deeply ironic, given the company's willingness stateside to work directly with ICE, which has used its technology to execute harmful policies that target migrants and asylum seekers. We could close our eyes and pretend that, contrary to all the evidence, Palantir is a rights-respecting company, or we can call this facade for what it is: another company placing profit over people, no matter what the human cost. So on September 10th, 2010, this is not very long ago, I urge my Liberal colleagues, while they're filibustering, to actually Google some of this stuff so we can maybe talk about this instead of all the prevarications they're making at our committee. But on September 10th, Amnesty International sent a letter to Palantir raising concerns about its contracts with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, for products and services for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. And its response, Palantir emphasized its contracts are only with the Criminal Investigative Division of ICE, called Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and that its software, quote, does not facilitate civil immigration enforcement by ICE's Enforcement and Removal Operations, the ERO unit. However, this claim, according to Amnesty International, is absolutely inconsistent with other evidence, indicating that Palantir's technology has been indeed used in this context, including U.S. government records, which the company continues to dispute. In 2017, ICE relied on Palantir technology to arrest parents and caregivers of unaccompanied children, leading to detentions and harming the children's welfare. Similarly, ICE has used Palantir technology to plan mass raids, as well with raids that ICE carried out in Mississippi in August 2019, which led to the separation of children from their parents and caregivers, causing irreparable harm to families and communities. These raids, in turn, have led to cases of prolonged detention and deportation. Now, I'm sure my Liberal colleagues have seen the horrific photos of children being held in cages in these ICE detention centers. It is a human rights abuse of striking and terrible magnitude. The fact that Palantir is one of the companies that has been used to identify and break up these families, I find is very, very concerning. And yet, I find even equally concerning is that David McNaughton, who Francisco Sorbera at this committee said is a great Canadian, was shocked that we would even mention his name at this committee, went and worked his way in through all the senior levels of the Liberal government to promote Palantir. And nobody raised questions. In fact, Mr. McNaughton, as far as I know, did not meet with Deputy Minister Friedland once. He met with her 3 times. She would have easily had time to check out who she was meeting with. On March 2nd, 2020, he met with Rick Tice, the Director of Policy and Cabinet Affairs, right in the Prime Minister's office. Palantir invited into the Prime Minister's office. March 5th, met with Honorable Chrystia Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. March 6th, meeting with Honorable Chrystia Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister. March 12th, meeting with Honorable Chrystia Freeland. I mean, is this how the Liberals do business? That all you have to do is hire a Liberal insider, and you can take any company that has the most horrific human rights abuses, and they'll walk right in and they'll be treated with total respect. And members of this committee will attack a member of parliament who raises questions about them for daring to raise questions about these great companies and the great Canadians involved with them. March 22nd, 2020, the Honorable Navdeep Bains, Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, arranged a meeting between individuals at Palantir and Public Service and Procurement Canada in connection with Palantir's offer of work. March 27th, 2020, Ryan Dunn, Chief of Staff to the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, was explained what Palantir was doing in other jurisdictions. So Mr. McNaughton was showing all the work that Palantir was doing in other countries. March 29th, 2020, Leslie Church, Chief of Staff to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada, meeting with David McNaughton. Now, Leslie Church, of course, is the classic Liberal who went from the Liberals to work for Google and then was embedded into the Department of Heritage, which was supposed to oversee Google. Needless to say, nobody's ever really done anything holding Google to account. Leslie Church, I believe, is now in with Chrystia Freeland. So March 29th, meets with David McNaughton. Oh, and the next day, March 30th, Leslie Church, meeting with David McNaughton. Now, I want to point out that David McNaughton could have pretty much written the book on lobbying. He knows the lobbying industry. He probably knows the lobbying industry as well as the Kielburger brothers seem to do. And like the Kielburgers, he never bothered to register to lobby. But again, he's a Liberal. He's a good friend. Who cares if the laws are being ignored here? And hey, he's representing this really great company called Palantir. April 1st, 2020. Jody Thomas, the Deputy Minister of the Department of National Defense. He reaches out to her to see what Palantir can do to help. April 5th, 2020. More correspondence with Jody Thomas, Deputy Minister of the Department of National Defense. May 1st, 2020. My God, David McNaughton is a busy boy. I think Palantir, I don't know what they paid him, but he sure's giving them their money's worth. March 30th, 2020. Bill Matthews, Deputy Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada. He's meeting with Palantir. April 3rd, 2020. Bill Matthews, the Deputy Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada. Man, Palantir, I tell you, they have the all-access pass to the Liberal government. All you got to do is buy somebody, put them to work for you, someone who's really close to Justin Trudeau, and you, hey, Bob's your uncle. April 9th, 2020. Bill Matthews, Deputy Minister, Public Services and Procurement Canada. More meetings to talk about the software that's available. And, you know, it's amazing. This is how they figured they were going to get around it. Palantir, this company known as the scariest company on earth, was going to give the Liberals their massive uh, data machine pro bono. They were going to help. They just want to help Canada. They were going to give it to them pro bono, and they figured that that was how they were going to evade the Lobbying Act. April 3rd, 2020, Simon Kennedy, Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science, and Economics, he's meeting to discuss the Palantir software. This is the software that they can track people. This is the software that's been accused of being involved in extrajudicial killings in the Middle East. A massive Palantir software that's taken children from their families and put them in cages. And then guess what happens? It all comes crashing down because I wrote to the ethics commissioner. And I asked the ethics commissioner, how is it possible that a former public office holder like David McNaughton could ignore his legal obligations to register to lobby? And why is he meeting with Krista Friedland? We actually didn't know who he had met with at that point. We just known that he had met with Navdeep Bains. But then we see this massive pattern. And so the ethics commissioner has written an unprecedented report where he's barred. Krista Friedland is not allowed to talk to David McNaughton for a year. Rick Tice is not allowed to talk to him for a year. Oh, and I forgot this. March 14th and March 30th, General Jonathan Vance, Chief of the Defense Staff of the Canadian Armed Forces, has been barred from talking to David McNaughton after having these meetings about getting Palantir's help on a pro bono basis, mind you, but getting Palantir's help when none of this was registered under the Lobbying Act. So now my Liberals friends who are going to tell us what, these are great Canadians, these are great companies, I'm just being scurrilous, just back off and let the Liberals continue to filibuster. What really shocks me is that the so-called liberal values here is that you can take what may be one of the scariest companies on the planet, put a liberal in front of it, and the liberals will open the doors. And there's been no effort to maintain the law of the land in terms of the Lobbying Act and any questioning about why we would turn over sensitive data of Canadians to a company like Palantir. Now, in the UK, at the same time, the Boris Johnson government gave Palantir the same kind of deal that the Liberal government was looking at getting them until we managed to expose this. And there was a huge backlash in the UK, and they were saying, why in God's name would we give sensitive medical information to Palantir? Now, is it possible that Palantir would do anything nefarious with this? Oh, certainly not. Not according to the Liberals. These are good companies that are being needlessly attacked by the NDP. I would refer you to the article in Bloomberg, April 19th, 2018. Peter Thiel's data mining company is using war on terror tactics to track American citizens. And the scary thing, Palantir is desperate for new customers. Yeah, they're desperate. They were going to do anything. They were even going to give their technology for free to the Liberals so that they could embed themselves in Canada. So I want to read to you from this because it shows you how insidious this technology is. So this is Bloomberg, April 19th, 2018. High above the Hudson River in downtown New Jersey City, a former U.S. Secret Service agent named Peter Caviccia III ran special ops for J.P. Morgan Chase and Company. His insider group, most large financial institutions have one, used computer algorithms to monitor bank employees, ostensibly to protect against perfidious traders and other miscreants. Aided by as many as 120 forward-deployed engineers from the data mining giant Palantir Technologies, Inc., which J.P. Morgan engaged in 2009, Caviccia's group vacuumed up emails and browser histories, GPS locations from company-issued smartphones, printer and download activity, and transcripts of digitally recorded phone conversations. Palantir's software aggregated, searched, sorted, and analyzed these records, surfacing keywords and patterns of behavior that Caviccia's team had flagged for potential abuse of corporate assets. Palantir's algorithm, for example, alerted the insider threat team when an employee started badging into work later than usual. Ooh. a sign of potential disgruntlement that would trigger further scrutiny and possible physical surveillance after hours by bank security personnel. Now, over time, Kaviccia himself went rogue. Former JP Morgan colleagues described the environment as Wall Street meets Apocalypse Now, with Kaviccia as Colonel Kurtz ensconced upriver in his office suite 8 floors above the rest of the bank security team. People in the department were shocked that no one from the bank or Palantir set any real limits. It all ended when the bank's senior executives learned that they too were being watched. And what began as a promising marriage of big data and global finance descended into a spying scandal, the misadventures of which have never been reported. But it also marked an ominous turn for Palantir, one of the richest valued startups in Silicon Valley. An intelligence platform designed for the global war on terror was weaponized against ordinary Americans at home. I read that and I just shudder to think that my liberal colleagues are obstructing our efforts to get answers from David McNaughton and Palantir. I shudder to think that this company that developed an intelligence platform for the global war on terror could be used to weaponize against ordinary citizens in North America. And yet they had this insider access. And we would never have found out if I hadn't contacted the ethics commissioner. So I think another really telling story is the role that Palantir was used to attack progressive groups and unions. In the February 10th, 2011, Think Progress article on the U.S. Chamber's lobbyists solicited hackers to sabotage unions and smear chamber political opponents. We find that Palantir was hired as part of a disinformation campaign to attack progressive opponents in the United States. The proposal called for creating a, quote, false document, perhaps highlighting periodical financial information to give a progressive group opposing the Chamber of Commerce and then subsequently expose that document as a fake to undermine the credibility of the Chamber's opponents. In addition, the group proposed creating fake insider persona to generate communications with Change to Win, that they would feed fuel between feuding groups, disinformation, create messages around action to sabotage or discredit the opposing organization, submit fake documents, and then call out the error, create concerns over the security of the infrastructure, create exposure stories, and if the process is believed to be not secure, they are done. Cyber attacks against the infrastructure to get the data on document submitters to kill the project. Since the servers now in Sweden and France are putting a team together to get access is more straightforward. A media campaign to push the radical and the reckless nature of groups like WikiLeaks and use sustained pressure. Now, this is really concerning because the idea of using disinformation tactics, we actually dealt with this. I raised this last week on why the Kielburgers had hired the group Firehouse Strategies, the liberal attack group that does disinformation campaigns, and why they're tied into Israeli disinformation. Now, I know that that's, seems to be just a passing connection. But, Ms. Latanzio accused me of attacking a great Canadian charity for raising questions about why so much money that's supposed to be helping children was used to attack and discredit potential political threats or journalists. But with Palantir being used with their massive data machine to create organized disinformation to undermine WikiLeaks, undermine progressive groups, undermine labor unions, is deeply concerning. Now, of course, Palantir has denied their involvement in the Chamber of Commerce campaign. And of course, Palantir said that, whoever was involved has been fired. But it shows the enormous power of a data giant that is up there with Google in terms of the amount of information it has on individual citizens. And that this is a company that came into Canada to set up contracts with the Canadian government, that hired a close friend of Justin Trudeau because of his contacts. And the Liberals let this company into all the top areas of decision making, very much like how the Kielburgers were able to walk in, and $912 million later, they were walking out. Bob's your uncle, everything was great. That was, of course, until we started to say, hey, how did this deal go down? But what I think is really concerning, even more so than the things happened, is that we are now dealing with a deliberate obstruction campaign by my Liberal colleagues to stop this committee from doing its job, to stop getting answers for the Canadian people, to be forced into a situation where we have to pretend that these things never happened because the Ethics Committee has been made functionally inoperable by the Prime Minister's office. I urge my colleagues to stop the obstruction and allow us to finish this report so that we can get the real information on how David McNaughton was able to work his way on the inside corridors of power, promoting a company that to me is as frightening and undemocratic and un-Canadian as Palantir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Angus. I have two people on the speakers list right now, Madam Shanahan and Mr. Fergus. Madam Shanahan.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank my honourable colleague. There's a little bit of echo. Has that been sorted out there? Okay. I thank my honourable colleague for his remarks. They're always interesting, and I just wanted to make an intervention because I'm sorry if colleagues noted I was on the speakers list on Friday, but I had to leave, and members will know that sometimes we are unavoidably obliged to be elsewhere. So I would just like to take a moment now to talk about where we are and where we thought that we would be able to get to, and I do ask colleagues to indulge with me just a little bit. I'm sorry that I missed the proceedings Friday afternoon. I did try to look at the blues, and I thank the clerk. I had a technical trouble accessing them, so I was not able to go through them at length. But it seems to me that the work was continuing, the work that we have been trying to do in the last little while to get to a place where there can be a path forward on the motion that is before us, and with good reason, because as members know, we do have other business that we need to get to, and just offhand, members of this committee and other committees are right now having to look at or deciding how much they will look at the main estimates that are those reports that have been put forward and are generally allocated to committees. And indeed the supplementary estimates as well, which is usually a good time for any committee, particularly ours, to look at what is one of the main functions as an MP, and that is the accountability function and the ability to recommend and to vote as members on behalf of our constituents on spending estimates. And so that is something I believe there's a due date for that, and I know that that's something that the committee would like to entertain, and and I can think we've had a number of notices of motions as well, some of them very very interesting in that they bring up many of the challenges that we're having now in dealing with the pandemic, in that we and Chair, who would have thought, even as little as 5 years ago, and certainly not 10 or 15 years ago, that the issues of privacy, the issues of access to information, the issues around how citizens are identified by public and private sector entities would become such a compelling issue in this day and age, particularly in regards to dealing with the pandemic. And I think that a number of colleagues here have already either brought forward notices of motion that would deal with those issues, or indeed may be contemplating them, because it is a constantly evolving and a field that I, for one, am learning a lot about. And so when we return to the motion here on hand, one of the last interventions that I made to this committee had to do with that we are looking for that path forward. And indeed, if I may say, when Mr. Angus first presented the motion, and Mr. Fergus was able to bring forward an amendment which just sharpened the focus on that motion, I think that we were in a very good place, and that was and that we would be dealing with exactly the issues that Mr. Angus brought up just earlier. We would already be in those meetings. But then when we had the amendment that was brought forward, I have to say that I, for one, still had trouble with the scope, with the timeline on that amendment that was reintroduced and ultimately passed here. And I understand that Friday there was considerable discussion, and that actually new amendments were proposed that would allow for the problem which actually came to light. I think it was in the last 10 days or so, regarding speaker spotlight in what you yourself had mentioned, Chair, that there were constraints around the production of the documents that were outside the control, if you will, that had to do with the legal and regulatory framework around how documents are dealt with, and I think that was the spirit that the amendment, I believe one amendment was brought forward by my colleague, Mr. Fergus, around addressing the documents that the speaker spotlight would have in their possession going back to 2013, and any other additional relevant documents as referenced in their public letter shared on November 10th, 2020. And I think members here know the letter that I'm referring to. I believe it was made public on Twitter, which had to do with, and I can quote here, we let Ms. Burke know, this is from the third or fourth paragraph, that because all of the speaking engagements took place more than 7 years ago, we do not have hard copies of the files as these had been purged in the normal course of business. And we also let Ms. Burke know that we do have some digital copies of documents that we would produce along with records of all the speaking engagements dating back to 2008 that were legally required by the order. Now, I understand from the Blues that amendment was voted down, and that there was an additional amendment that was recommended by my colleague Francesco Sabero, and that was a more in line. I guess I don't have to read it out, but just for the sake of clarity, Mr. Sabera moved that we add after Section B, Section C, that in order to comply with Canadian and provincial privacy laws, that any request for documents be limited to those documents in the organization's possession, as well as other relevant documents they may have. And I think that too, I understand that it was voted down, but I think that amendment too was in the spirit of complying with the request, but working with the constraints, the limitations that any business would have actually in the course of complying with the multitude of legislation and requirements and good practice that any business must work with. So, Chair, I just want to leave that there. That I think that we want to get to that good place, and I think that in the spirit of doing so, and I appreciate the numerous hours that we have spent debating this, but it was not for naught in that we did make some good progress, and we made some changes, and I think that all colleagues here can appreciate that we're always doing this balancing act. And contrary to what my colleague Mr. Angus said toward the top of his remarks today, it's not that we're here to help the Commissioner of Ethics and Conflict of Interest to do his job. We're here to make sure that the tools that are available, that the framework and within that anyone holding that office must work with is in fact more than just adequate, is in fact commensurate with doing the job at hand. So, Chair, I'm going to leave that there, and I again regret my sudden departure on Friday. I felt like, but that's the way we do things here, right, in committee. But I'm glad that I've had the opportunity today to speak to what I wanted to share last Friday. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Shanahan. I have two people on the speakers list now, Mr. Fergus and Mr. Couric. Mr. Fergus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank all members. And I will endeavor to be brief today. And Mr. Chair, I thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. I'd like to talk to you about last month on October 21st, the House defeated a motion which, in our view, included a clause E20B, that is substantially the same as the amendment of Madame Gaudreau, which is now part of the motion that is before us. And Mr. Chair, the following week on October 26th, This committee negatived, in our view, a substantially similar motion as the amendment of Madame Gaudreau, which is now part of the motion before us. Another week later, for the third time, it was again negatived by this committee, due in part to an acknowledgement by the NDP member that it is against the rules to allow a redo on the same motion. 3 decisions, 1 by the full House, 2 by this committee, but all 3 the same, that this motion should not go forward. Upon reflection, the second decision should never have had to take place in the first, place, something which I will get to in a moment. However, it does help to further our objection to this issue now coming before the committee for a second time, and before parliamentarians an unprecedented third time. When Section C of this motion was proposed by Madame Gaudreau, Liberal members challenged the decision of the chair, as is our right and privilege to do so. We did so, not out of malice to Madame Gaudreau, nor in any skepticism of the ability of you or any skepticism of the authority of you, Mr. Chair. Rather, we did so based on our reading and understanding of the procedure, rules, and precedents that guides our work, both in our committee work and in the House. At issue is a fundamental aspect of parliamentary procedure. What Speaker Milliken called on November 7th, 2006, and I will quote, a key principle, namely that the decision once made cannot be questioned again, but must stand as a judgment of this House. The Green Book, which we would all do well to pick up and read more often than I am sure most of us do, says in chapter 12, and I quote again, if a bill or a motion is rejected, it cannot be revived in the same session, although there is no bar to a motion similar in intent to one already negatived, but with sufficient variance to constitute a new question. And I go on. This is to prevent the time of the House being used in the discussion of motions of the same nature, with the possibility of contradictory decisions being arrived at in the course of the same session. In a footnote to this passage, footnote 373, it continues referencing Bourrineau's 4th edition of Parliamentary Procedure and Practice, and I quote, that a motion has been negatived cannot be proposed later as an amendment to the question. This seems to me to be precisely what has happened in this instance, in direct contradiction of parliamentary rules, procedure, and past precedent. Let me now repeat a previous quote that I just read, that this is to prevent the time of the House being used in the discussion of motions of the same nature, with the possibility of contradictory decisions being arrived at in the course of the same session. Mr. Chair, we are now faced with exactly that predicament that the rules have set out for us to avoid. The possibility of contradictory decisions being arrived at in the course of the same session. It isn't necessary for me to go through in great detail how we got to this point, skirting decades and decades of rulings and precedents. Our rules are quite clear, that a decision once made cannot be questioned again, but stand as the judgment of the House. I understand, I can't say, rather, that I nor my colleagues on this side fully understand the opposition's obsession over litigating this again. And we continue to disagree with the attempt to do indirectly what they failed to do directly, that is, by inserting as an amendment from a twice defeated motion, what we now see before us into what was previously, in our view, a reasonable motion. It is unfortunate that with all the issues facing our country and the world, not just the pandemic, but many other issues of rights and privacy, among others, members opposite would rather pursue this fishing expedition. While they have accused this side of obstruction, our goal all along has been to stand up for the rules and privileges of Parliament and parliamentarians. And Mr. Chair, before you assumed the chair, I spoke at length about this in our meetings over the summer. Unfortunately for the opposition, it appears partisanship, pettiness, and personal agendas, and the Conservatives' decade-long obsession with the Trudeau family now takes precedence over rules and procedure. If this motion ends up passing as the opposition holds majority at the committee, its validity will be immediately questioned, and it will raise serious questions about the ability of the motion to be enforced. Mr. Speaker, I think this, Mr. Chair, this is very important. Let me repeat. If this motion ends up passing as the opposition holds a majority at this committee, its validity will be immediately questioned, and it will raise serious questions about the ability of the motion to be enforced. Mr. Chair, we remain opposed to this motion in its current form containing Section C, which has already been decided upon 3 times, already twice more than it should have been allowed. We leave it to the opposition if they would like to ignore the rules yet again. Thank you, sir.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Angus, point of order.
Yeah, sorry, before we go ahead, I'm not contradicting anything my colleague said, but I think he has laid out a statement that I think is very concerning, and I'd like you to clarify. You did make the decision on allowing the motion to go forward as it is. The Liberals seem to be hinting that this would be an invalid vote if the committee took it, that would be open to challenge. I don't know if they're saying legal challenge. Could you look into this to tell us if the committee votes, as I'm always understanding, the committee is master of its own house. If a committee with the democratically elected majority votes, can that vote be threatened or undermined if the Liberals decide to take this to another level?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Angus. Look, when I ruled on this, I made myself very clear in what the premise was. In fact, Mr. Fergus, in his words just now, actually mentioned the exception that we had to deal with, and that was that although there were similarities to the previous motion, because it was framed in an entirely different motion, there was significant enough variance that I ruled it in order. My ruling was challenged and it was sustained. So I think we'll just proceed in that fashion. And certainly if there's any mechanism that a member here wants to pursue in order to assure that their point of view is heard, then they can certainly do that. Mr. Currick.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I certainly have found the discussions here today further enlightening. And I do have a few comments to make. However, with the comments that Mr. Fergus made, I think he was calling for a vote. Now, he said time and time again, don't do indirectly what you wouldn't do directly. Well, I think he was referring that it's time to move on to a vote. He laid out the position of the government, and that's fair. That's entirely fair. If the Liberals want to oppose this motion, that's fine. But certainly I know that certainly myself and other members of the opposition have opinions on the matter. And certainly if there was a willingness, I would move that things go to a vote. And pending the outcome of that, I may have a few more things to say, but I would ask if the chair would indulge that question.
Okay, I'll check and see. I've got 2 members that aren't visually on the screen right now, but I'll see if there's some consensus for those people that are in the room presently and on the screen, if there's a consensus to move to a vote. I don't see any objection. Mr. Workington, are you online? Are you having trouble with your internet? Is that, do we know if he's actually still connected? Okay. All right, colleagues, it looks like there's consensus, so we'll move to a vote.
Voting on the motion of Mr. Angus as amended. Please say yay when I call your name if you're for, and nay if you're opposed when I call your name. Mr. Dong.
Chair, I vote against.
Mr. Fergus.
Madame la greffière, je suis contre la motion.
I vote against.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Shanahan.
Against.
Mr. Cervera.
Je vote contre la motion.
Mr. Kirk.
Against.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur le Président, je vote pour la motion.
I vote for the motion.
I vote for the motion.
Madame Gaudreau. Mr. Angus.
I vote for the motion.
Yeas, pour, 5, 5. Nays, contre, 5, 5.
I'll vote for the motion. Okay, the motion is carried. Colleagues, now we'll move on to the details of the study. We still have some time in this meeting, so we might as well use it in order to talk about where we'll go in regards to witnesses. So we'll just refresh the screen here that's in front of me. Unless that is refreshed already. I don't, is that a new speakers list that's in front of me? Or? Okay. Yeah, that'd be great. Mr. Workington, did you have your hand up?
I do.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Work.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Dong.
I from the list I can see in front of me, you know, at the time I raised my hand, Mr. Fergus was the only one has his hand up, and I think that he has spoke to that opportunity, and I believe, at least seeing on the screen here, I was the first one raised the hand. I just want you to double check with the clerk if that was the case.
Well, I certainly don't want to put the clerk in a tough spot. We had a problem where we had the hands up from the previous speakers list, and people were putting their hand up at the time where we were actually trying to refresh the list.
Mm.
In fact, you don't see Mr. Workington's because his came up during the refreshment and then was taken off. So I saw his come up after it was all refreshed, and now I have a new list. So I'm pretty sure I put my hand up right after the vote. So I just I don't know at what point that the list was refreshed, and I just have a feeling that and I clearly raised my hand to speak, not on the previous vote motion. Yeah,
but with something new.
I will recognize you. I will recognize you second, Mr. Dong. I'll go with Mr. Workington, and then it'll be Mr. Dong, Madam Shanahan, Mr. Angus, and Mr. Fergus.
Well, point of order.
Yes.
My name was on the list, and then it went off, and then I had to put it back on. So yeah. I'm willing to accept, but I just think Mr. Dong's trying to jump the queue.
Yeah, it was. I agree. It was messy. I saw it flickering a couple times. We're trying to do the best that we can here, colleagues, and I apologize. I cannot even guarantee I have total accuracy, and the only thing I could do is actually refresh everything, and then everybody just have to race the keyboard. So if you keep your comments brief, we can be as fair as possible, and we'll go through the list. My apologies. There was no attempt to short anybody. It's just trying to deal with the technology that we have in front of us, colleagues.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Madam Shanahan.
Yes, I feel that I must speak up on this because you have shown flexibility in accepting blue hands up prior to gaveling in, for example, and given now that we have the hybrid people in person and using the hybrid system, I appreciated your flexibility and I count on your fairness in that regard. But I have to agree with my colleague, Mr. Dong, and I saw Mr. Angus's hand go up as well, that I think, frankly, Mr. Workington wasn't even on screen. So it's, I think we would appreciate your fairness and flexibility in dealing with the speaking list. Could you name it now again?
Sure, I could. Mr. Workington, Mr. Dong, Madam Shanahan, Mr. Angus, Mr. Fergus. Mr.
Thank you, Chair. I won't be long here. I just do think that it's important for us to quickly proceed now to a work plan for the motion that we just passed. Obviously, documents will come to us, and we'll have the opportunity to see those documents as it was prescribed in the motion. But there are significant other elements that I think we need to proceed with in the interim. Obviously. There is the will of the committee to proceed with the WE study, to complete the WE study. Obviously, there was significant work on that before prorogation and before the Prime Minister shut down Parliament and the investigation into this matter. And of course, we would like to expeditiously move on that. I think that while the Liberal members may not want that, I think that it's important for that to be resolved. And so, in conjunction with the documents coming forward, I think we should put forward. I guess I would seek the chair's direction in terms of submitting additional witnesses for the completion of the WE study. And then, as prescribed in Mr. Angus's motion with regards to the other elements, I think that we could probably weave in other witnesses as they become available for some of the other elements as well. And so I'd be very interested in other committee members' I guess perspective in terms of how we should do this, or how we should submit witnesses, and in terms of what that all looks like. But I do think that it would be important for us to move expeditiously to complete the WE study, and we will be submitting at least initial witnesses within the day, if that would be helpful to the chair and other committee members.